I'd like to start and talking about political geography here. Biggest thing that you guys really need to focus on is the idea of sovereignty. And sovereignty is the concept that all states have the legal right within their boundaries to economic rights, political rights, to administer within those boundaries. So one of the issues that I really wanted you guys to focus on was issues dealing with um, how sovereignty is coming into a challenge today, especially when we start to think about geopolitics. And geopolitics is the idea that human systems are constantly in a state of spatially organizing the land to fit human needs. So geopolitics is all about movement of borders, the exclusive economic zones, tapping into resources, building alliances. All of that is part of geopolitics. So geopolitics is study of geography and politics. So when we think about geopolitics historically, a couple of people that you think about is this guy named Retzel. And Retzel says that that all states are organic. So states start off in an infancy, they build their economy, they start off very crude in their government and their political systems. And then as they grow, they develop more economically, social classes start to develop, and over time they grow and then they collapse on themselves. So Retzel is this idea of the organic state. It's inevitable for every state to collapse or decline. There's no way that a state can be a hegemon. And a hegemon forever. Hegemons are, those ultimate powers, or those powers that are dominant over the world. So when we start to think about things like the Cold War, where you had the Soviet Union, the United States, we're talking about a bipolar world, and we don't have what's called a hegemon. A hegemon would be, an example would be the United States was a hegemon after the collapse of the Soviet Union for that short period of time. And in reality, the United States has been a hegemon since 1991-92, but with the growth of China in East Asia, and they're exerting their force into the South China Sea, and kind of flexing their economic muscle and expanding outwards and building into Africa, especially in the last 15 years. China really started in 2005, 2006, and then after China started to really build up their and belong to the World Trade Organization. So really it was 2001 when China joins the World Trade Organization. That's when China kind of propels. So the United States was a hegemon for about 10 years. You got to think really on a hegemon scale. You got to think Roman Empire. They dominated so much for so long. The British Empire was a hegemon for roughly 100 years. So we started thinking hegemons were the political, economic, and cultural power of the world. So there's been very few hegemons, and they kind of, and while that's happening, that's where you get those paxes. Pax in Latin means peace, so a time of peace. Pax Americana, since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Pax Britannia, which was the 1800s and the growth of the British Empire. Pax Romana. So anytime in history we think of pax, you had a hegemon. But for the most part, the world hasn't been that way. And with decolonization in 1960s, we've added roughly 120, 130 countries in the world since the 1960s. So that's kind of destabilized and created a new balance in the world, because most of those countries that have joined the United Nations have been less developed countries from their LDCs, and that's given them a lot of power. So we got to think about those old core countries, before the 1960s, and even in the 1970s and 80s, they kind of controlled the United Nations. And now that these LDCs have gained their independence from their colonial powers in the era of decolonization, we're starting to see a world that has many different players in it, and that kind of changes geopolitics and how countries interact. It brings a much greater emphasis on multilateralism, where states have to work together. They have to build alliances. They have to build trade blocs. They have to interact with one another in a peaceable manner. Otherwise, they're going to find somebody else. There's just too many players in the world. And there's my cat. So what you have in pre-1960, you had a few players in the world, those dominant powers, a dozen countries that could pretty much dictate politics of the world, and they were able to use their force. Well, that's not necessarily true anymore, and that's what's really challenging sovereignty today. Sovereignty in a state's rights. There's more state players, and there's small states, there's large states, and everybody's kind of jockeying for power and reorganizing the world. But definitely in a multilateral world. So when a country tries to go unilateral, when they want to do it by themselves, or they want to become self-sufficient and kind of cut off from the world, or if there's a problem in the world like with Iraq, and we try to get the UN together to deal with the terrorism in Iraq and Afghanistan, we got Britain on our side, but for the most part, there weren't very many other players, and the United States was kind of going at it unilaterally. And when you go at it unilaterally, you can start to change your image in the world. So that's one of the struggles with sovereignty, is the state trying to protect, the United States trying to protect itself against terrorists and protect itself from illegal immigrants and other people that might threaten the national security and the sovereignty of the United States. They were trying to defend ourselves, or we were trying to defend ourselves as Americans. So what we started to see, after 2001, because we were going unilateral, other countries started to seek, and they started to find other players, and it hurt the image of the United States. So we could see how a state's trying to protect its sovereignty and protect its own boundaries, but at the same time, we're in a world where there's too many players that unilateral approach. So multilateralism is much more, and that's a personal opinion, much more conducive to the world that we're in today. So sovereignty is being challenged, and when we think about sovereignty and territoriality is the idea that a state wants to exert rights, and they have a connection to a place. So we start to think of places like Taiwan and China and territoriality. China seeing Taiwan as part of them, and building the island in the South China Sea, and using that United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea in 1983, and the idea that the exclusive economic zone goes 200 miles. And, the United States has a massive you say economic zone. China is trying to exert theirs because they want those rare earth metals, especially in a technological world. Those rare earth metals, wherever they are very, very powerful. So it's not necessarily coal or oil or I guess you say gold or diamonds, the old resources. It's those tech resources, those tech minerals, and a few places have them, and a lot of them are either in the ocean. There's some in the Gulf of Mexico. There's a lot in the Pacific, and there's a lot of them are also in LDCs. So that kind of, in that sense of how do we get those resources and how states interact. Remember, they have sovereign rights, and sometimes states give away those sovereign rights. So we started to think about, the legacy of colonialism and not building up the LDCs and leaving behind the sense of lack of roads, lack of infrastructure, governments that are weak, that are corrupt. Constant overturn between dictatorship to a weak democracy and back and forth to some form of autocracy. But it shows the destabilized world that we're in as a result of colonialism, and in the core with the neocolonialism and constant exploitation, either by corporations or still those core countries are the political powers. But there's some rising ones. We're starting to see a multi-core world. Europe's still a core. United States is still a core. But we're starting to see players like China in East Asia, which is challenging Japan, which is our and South Korea, which are our closest allies. And we start to think about how do we curb China, but we start to think about those rights and those connections. So, at the end of the day, sovereignty is a big issue. So what about stateless nations? What about the Kurds? What about the Basques and the Catalans? So we start to think about the Catalans, challenge the idea of sovereignty in the world. And we see this sense that sovereignty with the Catalans challenging it, voting for independence, but not necessarily having the right to declare its independence. And the EU, they don't want that to happen because with Europe, they're actually pretty multi-ethnic. Many of the countries have many ethnicities and some fledgling little small, what we would call separatist groups. So giving Catalan their independence may inspire some other separatist groups in France, in southern Germany, parts of Italy. So it could start spiraling in, and that's where we get devolution. A lot of these states are giving some autonomy. So with Catalan and the Basques, basically suing for independence, the Spanish can't come back and say, hey, we'll give you some self-rule, we'll give you some more rights. And that's what devolution is. And we're trying to see that spread of federalism. So when we start to think about LDCs, the legacy of colonialism, the exploitation, the core strength, but we're in a multilateral world, and we start to think about those stateless nations, the movement where these separatist movements are getting a lot more voice, and in a world where we believe in self-determination, where people should have a right to their own borders, their own country, and a right to their own sovereignty. And we've seen a few states, South Sudan within the last 15 years, East Timor within the last 15 years. So we've seen a few states created, and possibly we might see some more states created. And Scotland voted, almost went independent, but they decided and voted to stay with the United Kingdom about 3-4 years ago. So we're starting to see that push for devolution. We're starting to see the push for federal state, and that's that movement of, how do we appeal to those groups with modern technology, modern connectivity. These individuals have a lot more say and a lot more voice, and we're starting to see an appeal to the masses, a global appeal to the masses. So, that's challenging state sovereignty. When things like this right here, the internet and global communications are challenging state sovereignty too, because they transcend state borders. And some states allow for free press and free movement of ideas and knowledge, and because of that interconnectivity, it connects people that may not, care about the Catalans, but care about independence, care about people's rights here in the United States. So you might have Americans supporting Catalan independence, not having a clue what the Catalans have gone through Basque, or what this would mean for Spain. And that's why geopolitics and sovereignty is being greatly challenged by today with modern technology. So the other thing we start to think about the world is with decolonization, and especially with the fall of communism and the Soviet Union in 1991, we're starting to see democratization. We're starting to see the growth of democracies around the world, the rise of, and that's a great thing. And when we looked in class about the importance of democracy, one thing democracy does is it gives people a voice, which is fueling a lot of those what we would call separatist movements, independence movements, this idea that in self-determination, these people are these individuals, the Walloons and the Flems in Belgium, or as we saw with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Latvians, the Estonians, the Uzbeks, all these individuals who wanted their independence. So we can see in democracy gives people a voice, so they're going to want more independence. So we might see more countries created in the world, and the more countries there are, in that kind of changes the geopolitics, it changes the power structure in the world. Being the world power is a struggle in today's world. But anyways, democracy is spreading, and it has different forms. So our democracy is a republic, a presidential republic, where some places it's a parliamentary republic, or you get a constitutional monarchy. In some fashion or form, democracy spreading throughout the world, but it gives people a voice, and it actually leads to less violence, and it leads to more peaceful interaction between states. So democracy has been a great thing. So, I mean, I've mentioned Cold War to the present, with the United States being a hegemon, and how the world is kind of changing with China on the rise, and Iran, especially in the Middle East. Iran, with Iraq being basically Saddam Hussein being deposed, and Iran is now asserting itself as kind of a regional player in the Middle East, and that's kind of changing the geopolitics in the region. You have Saudi Arabia, which is the United States' closest ally, and Iran since 1979 has been kind of a thorn in the United States side. So we're trying to balance supporting the state of Israel at the same time supporting the state of Saudi Arabia, because they're the major oil player there in the region, and they're Mecca's there, and there's a lot of religio issues going on there. But anyways, supporting those two puts us at odds with Iran, but Iran's asserting itself in many ways. So we can start to see that those struggles, even in the Middle East, how do you balance Saudi Arabia? How do you balance? And that's geopolitics, and your alliances, and how do you support them? And do you give the aid? So these are all challenges to state sovereignty. How do countries go after terrorism when people within that country the government has a sovereign right? So when a state invades another state, I mean, that's a violation of sovereignty. So tackling terrorism is about states working together, multilateralism. And all states do not support terrorism. There are some states that do, but most states don't want terrorism because it destabilizes them too. So, where an attack in one country can destabilize a country elsewhere too. So we got to think about terrorism as a global problem. So we start thinking, Iran in the Middle East, you've got China in East Asia challenging Korea and Japan. And Germany's kind of the power in Europe with Great Britain and a couple other players. But we've talked about the EU and how it's weakening, and with Brexit, that's a challenge to sovereignty too. So I'm going to switch gears and talk about Brexit a little bit here. Brexit, the kind of the foundation was a lot of British people felt like how Americans do. They felt like they've gotten a raw deal from EU. They've seen more benefit for the European or the continental countries than the Brits themselves. They feel like the free movement of people, it's kind of allowed immigrants to come in, and they see the diminishing culture of it. So it's economic, it's cultural. So we start to see how much Britain feels kind of on the outside of all of this. So as a result, when they went to the polls a year and a half ago, large in part, the younger people wanted to stay with the EU, and the older people, the Brits voted to say, we don't want to belong to Brexit. It's a very complex issue, but it's really about sovereignty. And the British people and the British government want sovereign rights, and they feel that the EU, maybe they went too far in a sense of allowing too much freedom. And as a result, they're trying to, Brexit is about taking back that sovereignty and their sovereign rights to make deals. Because, when you belong to a supranational organization, you give up sovereignty. So with Brexit, they want a right to make deals and alliances that benefit Brits, not just Europeans. And that's the struggle we talked about in class with the EU, is it's about, can I just accept that I'm European? But at the same time, we have a cultural thing. The Brits, even though they're in Europe, feel a sense we're British. We have a different history than just being European. And that's one of the struggles, especially with the EU. And many thought the EU would kind of be the poster child for the future of like a new world order, or a way the world could reorganize. And it's struggling. Weak players in the East. Italy's weak, Greece is weak. What about Turkey? Turkey would have been an important player in there economically. They're Muslim, but they're more Western than they are Arabic. They're more developed than the Middle East region. So Turkey would give the EU kind of a power play into the Middle East. But at the same time, Turkey has a lot of human rights violations. Its governments and its elections aren't as free. They crack down on dissidents. So they don't fit the democracy mold, even though they might fit economically. The democracy and the human rights, they just don't fit the EU. So that's been kind of the challenge with allowing Turkey to belong to the EU. So there's been weak players, there's been strong players, and as a result, that idea of the strong have to hold up the weak, and the weak can draw down the strong, and that's where Brexit comes in. The country kind of saying, I'm not going to deal with this. Germany, a year and a half ago, kind of said, we're going to bail people out. Well, 2 years ago, they're going to bail people out. And Germany kind of doubled down on everything, and they're even more involved, or at least there's a lot more on their plate because they did that. So the EU kind of hinges upon the strength of Germany and what Germans are willing to do for the EU. So, if Brexit goes through and Brits out and Germany can't really handle it over the next couple of years, we might see the EU collapse completely. So we start to think about this idea of state sovereignty. How much are people willing to give for the benefit of their country? So whether it's a trade bloc or an alliance, it's all about giving up sovereignty to belong to something else. And that's being challenged in a globalized world. And with new global players, it's even being challenged more. There was Samuel Huntington, was a guy who wrote about a dozen years ago, wrote something called The Clash of Civilizations. And he kind of believed that the world was divided in 7 civilizations, in the Middle East, and there's Asia, and there's Europe. And basically he said that there's these fault lines. All these civilizations kind of have these, where one civilization or culture meets another culture, and the conflicts are going to happen where those are. And we kind of see it, Syria, parts in the Middle East. So there is some truth in the sense of the world may kind of fall into this domino theory, where things might start to fall in the wrong direction. But we don't know. So anyways, going back to geopolitics, I talked about the idea of states grow, states decline. It's just inevitable is what Retzel says. The other ones that we start thinking about is Rimland theory and Heartland theory. And Heartland's really like Eurasia. It's kind of Eastern Europe, Russia, and the idea whoever kind of like a castle, whoever controlled the heartland can control the rest of the world. And that's why trying to maintain Europe as a core. And then the Rimland theory is the domino theory, like let's control the rim, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, up to the Mediterranean. If you can control that, then you can control the heartland. So that was kind of the going back and forth and during the Cold Wars and in the early 1900s. So which part of the world do you control? But we know this. The domino theory says, the idea that, the United States is going to get involved in Korea. The United States is going to get involved in Vietnam. We're going to get involved in Iran. We're going to get involved in all these other places throughout the Cold War, what we call quasi battles or quasi wars, where the United States got involved either economically, militarily, or politically to basically make sure that communism couldn't take root, and vice versa. The communists did the same thing against the United States. And that domino theory, the idea of if one fell, the rest would. And we know that Vietnam fell and North Korea fell and the dominoes didn't fall. So it didn't really come to fruition. But this idea that it's all about how states interact. And Alfred Mahan says, whoever controls the sea has controlled the world. And that's been pretty true. I mean, the Greeks or the Romans or the Brits or now the United States. So I would say there's a lot of weight with Alfred Mahan's sea theory. Having the strongest navy and being able to get anywhere in the world is a very, very powerful thing. All right. So we started to think about some other issues. I talked about boundary disputes. That's kind of touches with the UN Convention Law of the Seas, 1983. This idea that China's building that island in the sea, and it's challenging the boundaries. What about the Philippines and Vietnam and Chinese Taipei and Indonesia, who are all U.S. allies? How by expanding in those exclusive economic zones, they have sovereign rights to fish, get minerals, resources, all that stuff from the ocean floor. So that's kind of the issue there with a boundary dispute is should China be able to build this island in the middle of the ocean? They have claimed the reef. And according to what makes sovereign territory, they have a station there. So technically it's their sovereign territory, according to the UN. So it kind of stretches, what's really legal and what's not. And as a result, there's a lot of, it challenges the idea of sovereignty. All right. When we start to think about those exclusive economic zones and boundary disputes we talked about. So if you look at, and I can't talk about every boundary dispute, but we did a chart with boundary disputes in class, and I would look over some of those boundary disputes because it shows in a sense of what people are fighting over with boundary disputes, and it shows in a sense of identity and how it can prevent international interactions, those boundary disputes. And it leads to other players. So if there's a boundary dispute in, say, the Middle East, it might bring in people like the United States and Britain and China because we all have interest. And that's the thing about sovereignty is even though it's not within our borders in a globalized world, we all have interest somewhere, whether it's culturally or politically or economically. And when one part of the world is destabilized, it can affect another country indirectly. And that's why in a world today, multilateralism is so important because countries, no matter where they're at, somehow or another impact. For an example, if there's an economic problem in the United States, China's going to make sure the United States doesn't fall because they have a vested interest economically in the United States. We're their market. So if the United States slows down, that's going to affect China too. So there's not this kind of worldview that it's an end game, that China's out to get the United States, or the United States is out to get China, or Iran's out to get. Countries aren't necessarily like that. That's an old way of thinking. That's a way of thinking that kind of dominated 100 years ago, but it's not so anymore. States still have to consider real world issues and look at the world realistically and not necessarily idealistically. But to think that one country's out to get another is kind of false information. The idea that countries have a vested interest in one another, and they are still out to make more. So the Chinese are out to make more for their people and their country just as much as the United States is. That's called our sovereign rights. And how countries interact is how they can kind of build their own economy and strengthen themselves. So countries are kind of fluxing, kind of like Retzel said. They grow and they shrink. Do they necessarily die? I don't know. Will the United States decline? Well, we're not the hegemon anymore. So we've kind of gone down. It doesn't mean we're going to collapse like the Roman Empire, but it's definitely going to say, we could flux and then we could go back up. This idea, it's organically moving, states move in and out. All right. Pay attention to centripetal and centrifugal forces. What's going to bind a state and what's going to break a state apart. So we start thinking things like physical geography, being fragmented or being too mountainous or desert. Those physical aspects can definitely challenge a state just as much as having access to the sea. Physical geography, being a landlocked state is a horrible thing for a state. It makes them have to really interact with the other states around them because they need those states. So having access to the sea is very, very important. So physical geography, where you're located and what resources you have and your situation. How close are you to the core? How close, are you located near a major trade route? I mean, think about southern parts of Africa. As soon as they built the Suez Canal in Egypt, that kind of weakened the states in South Africa. There was no reason to stop off and use those ports anymore. We could just cut the time. Same thing kind of happened with parts of South America when the Panama Canal was built. So we can see, economic interactions, political interactions being changed. So physical geography, where you're located, how your state is shaped. So if you're elongated, think you got to build a long road system where compact is ideal. So we start to think about those state shapes, physical geography, topography, mountains, resources that you have. All those things can be beneficial. So there's many, many examples that I can't go over. So having abundant resources or lack of resources, having like I said, access to the sea, or having fresh water, right? In places that don't have fresh water. That's one of the things in the Middle East with the Jordan River, with Israel right now. It's not just religion, it's really a water issue. Israel's got water. Jordan doesn't have water, and Israel can control the water. So some of the conflict has nothing to do with religion, it's resources. And that's what you got to understand is when we went back to ethnic conflicts, when we talked about ethnic conflicts in class, what we found out is a lot of these aren't about ethnicity versus ethnicity. It's about something else. It's resources or economics. It's something that, and the ethnicity makes the us versus them. So the conflicts over resources and a growing world and a growing population, that strain makes those ethnic differences much greater, and it can lead to much conflict, especially when you have a different ethnicity. It's in us versus them. I'm going to take it because they're not like me. So we can see how places like Israel with the water. So that is a centrifugal force. Cultural, having a national identity, a national anthem, in a state that's multinational like the United States, having a national anthem, having a flag, having holidays, all those are centripetal forces. Because how do you take a multinational state and bind them? And that's a struggle for a multinational or multi-ethnic state. That's a centrifugal force itself. So you got to create an identity. So having a uniform culture, a nation or a nation state, there are very few nation states. Japan, Denmark, and with the movement of people and immigration and people settling in new places, the idea of a nation state, which existed 80 years ago, you still had quite a few nation states. With the movement of people, the guest workers in Germany are coming from Turkey, that kind of made them not a nation state anymore. So just with the movement of people nowadays, the idea of a nation state is going to be diminishing throughout the world. So we're seeing a lot more multinational states in the world. So cultural, that schooling could be part of cultural, starting education, all that can build up a national identity, having cultural value, sharing a culture, and that's important. Economic strength, providing jobs, having jobs, economic, a striving economy, and a weak economy could be a centrifugal force. Brain drain could be a centrifugal force. So we just got to think about what would weaken and what would strengthen. All right. So I talked about alliances, NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement. You have some trade agreements. You have some political military alliances. All those are supranationalist forces in a multilateral world. The reason why supranationalism is growing is because there's just so many countries. There's no way 2 or 3 countries can just dominate the world anymore. They need friends. So if the United States didn't make allies in Africa, or the United States didn't make allies in South America, somebody else would. Brazil will go look for other allies. They'll look elsewhere, and they're going to look for a power player. We got to think of the power players in the world: Germany, Great Britain, the United States, China. So when we look at it, there's maybe a half dozen, maybe 10 power players in the world economically. So that's why, building alliances is important, and having friendly relations with other countries, and why supranationalism is on the rise is there's just so many countries. And if we're going to interact and, maintain our state and grow economically and be a power player in the world, then you have to make friends. So it's a very thin line. In the news, they were talking about North Korea, and somebody, or our national security advisor, saying something about, using military force against North Korea. And that's kind of soured the talks between North Korea and the United States right now, because somebody in the executive branch, not the president, had said something, and that gets back. And now it's, how do you repair that, what I want to call repair that relationship? And that's the thing, is in a technologically connected world, what you say is not in private anymore. 100 years ago, I could say something in a room and it'd be private. It's all hearsay. Nowadays, anybody can get information. So as a result, it's much more important for states to protect their information and watch what they say, because we don't want to offend. We don't want, it's all about power, geopolitics. All right. I talked about Brexit, Turkey, modern technology. Look over some of those examples that we talked about in politics, the political unit. So look over your border disputes, look over ethnic conflicts, some of those charts that we covered. So in territorial disputes, talked about a lot, stateless nations. There's some examples. And the breakup of states, just balkanization, the idea of those ethnic forces coming through. So I covered quite a bit about sovereignty, and I wanted to focus on that. I'm going to shift up a little bit here. Looking at my notes here, I want to talk about industry too. Another issue I think might come up is that idea of the new international division of labor with the deindustrialization accord. That's very, very important. This may come up. So the deindustrialization accord, we know that industry has been moving away from core countries, and secondary sector has moved towards more less developed countries, places like Mexico with the maquiladoras, or we see some places in Argentina or Chile for the United States, but also we're seeing stuff in Vietnam, the Philippines, Indonesia. Even China is starting to outsource because they're growing economically. They're moving up that ladder of Rostov's model. So as a result, they're even outsourcing to some countries that are close to them. And as a result, we're just seeing this movement, these footloose industries, these multinational corporations are going to pick up and move wherever they get the best benefit. So it could be better taxes, it could be cheaper labor, some kind of incentive that draws them there. So companies are always looking to increase profits. So as a result, in the core countries, labor costs are high. Taxes typically are a little higher. Just the cost of living is higher, so you have to pay your workers more, and fuel costs are higher. So we start to see it with the unions and everything. This kind of pushed companies outwards to find, with the free trade, really what started the deindustrialization was the free trade agreements, NAFTA, and then all the ones that have followed it. So, opening up of China in the 1970s and definitely in the 1990s. As a result, companies and the deindustrialization, industries moving to the southern parts of the United States, to being outsourced or offshored to other countries around the world. So we're starting to see that movement towards the periphery. And that's what the periphery, that's what the new industrialization or new international division of labor is. That's the idea that companies are moving to less developed parts of the world, and we're starting to see secondary sector and more low-skilled jobs be placed there. And that's causing new shifts. It's changing cultures. It's changing economies. It's helping LDCs grow economically. We talked about in China in class where the dollar is almost as equal, or workers' pay, minimum pay is almost equal to the dollar of the United States. So that 1-to-1, and we're starting to see what we call reshoring. That's where companies are coming back. And there's even Chinese companies that are investing into American industry or old industrial core because the infrastructure is there. We see that these industrial buildings that haven't been revitalized, and companies coming back into these gray fields and these brown fields and reinvesting and reshoring. These American companies coming back, but also Chinese companies investing because they need access to the American market. And shipping costs and labor costs are not necessarily as beneficial as they were 30 years ago. So we can really see, like I mentioned earlier, with China growing in their region, ever since China became part of the WTO in 2001, they have skyrocketed in trade. So the growth of China and access to markets, that's what they're really target there. So we can see this massive growth in China trying to find, just within the last 15, 16 years, China's growing so fast that they can't even sustain themselves. They're struggling themselves to maintain that advantage, what we call that comparative advantage economically. So some of their companies are even outsourcing to the United States. So outsourcing, offshoring, always trying to find ways to cut costs, whether it's abroad or we're giving it to different companies. Remember, outsourcing would be a call center here. Advertising might be for this company, and we're going to specialize in these areas. So outsourcing cut costs, it streamlines everything, it makes it more efficient. But once again, it shares ideas and it spreads. That's what we call stimulus diffusion. That's how Samsung was created. It borrowed from Japan. So outsourcing of Japanese technologies to Korea led to Samsung. So we can see how with outsourcing and offshoring, it's going to create a sharing of ideas. We're creating a new international division of labor. So as I mentioned, foreign trade zones in LDCs, we're seeing them in Africa, we're seeing them in Southeast Asia. On the city models, those foreign trade zones, having access to the core is very, very important for an LDC. So those foreign trade zones are popping up. In China, we call them special economic zones in the South China, where they started to really invest in the 1970s. And then after the 1990s, China really skyrocketed, or real close to home, maquiladoras. So we got to think the diffusion of industry and its impact. As a result, we've seen a growing population, increased food supply, movement of people to cities, and that's where we're getting the mega cities and LDCs, and we're really seeing the opportunity provided. So we can see, just like the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s in Europe and the United States, it led to a growing population, increased food supply. People are finding new, more efficient ways to produce things. It led to a movement of people, urbanization. It led to new opportunities, more specialized. We moved from secondary to tertiary. Same things happening in the LDCs with the new International Division of Labor, with the deindustrialization of the core, with offshoring and outsourcing. The same thing happened in the periphery. It's just happening faster. They're experiencing growth at a much quicker rate because, one, we're once again more connected technologically, communication networks. We're not DDDD. We're not using Morse code. We're using electro technology, almost instantaneous. We can get information that we saw just in time. What I want to call just in time production with the Honda and the Toyota plant, and same idea. If I had a problem here, if there was an issue with a production, I can easily shoot out an email, or I can send out a code, and it can be handled like that. My wife in marketing, these issues are handled in real time. So that's the world that we're seeing with the deindustrialization of the core. It's industrialization 2.0. We're seeing it much more rapid, real time. And as a result, we're seeing growing population, much faster growing population with new technologies and new medicines, all that stuff that was developed 100 years ago that the core experienced at a very slower rate, right? About 150, 200 years. It's happening in roughly 10 to 50 years. So we're crunching it, that idea of that space-time compression. Everything's getting closer and closer and faster and faster. So as a result, we're seeing really faster growing populations, increased urbanization, mega cities. We're still struggling with increased food supply. More of it's about waste, but we're always trying to find. That's where the Green Revolution came in, right? Agricultural unit. So we're starting to see the increase of GMOs and fertilizers and pesticides, and always trying to find ways to increase our food supply. So it's still happening, and that's still one of the issues in the world. So a lot more movement of people and a lot more opportunity. So the big thing is demand for resources makes it cheaper, access to new and grow. The big thing today is how do we access more markets? That's China. China's exclusive economic zone. They're really trying to tap into new markets, investing in Africa, building those cities that we looked at in class, tapping into those rare earth metals that are in oil in the South China Sea. That's all about them trying to get access to markets. If they're able to do that, that's less they have to import. That's more that they can utilize to export. It makes them a bigger player in that part of the world. And they can start to shift and utilize their resources a lot better and specialize. And that's all China's doing. And from our perspective, if we were doing it, that's what's best for us, and China's doing what's best for them, sovereignty. So what we're seeing here is countries are always trying to find access to new markets. That's why free trade agreements are so important. That's why multilateralism and making agreements with other countries are so important. Because if we can sell our goods and access to new markets, we got to understand there is no self-sufficient market anymore. There's no way a country can isolate. So a country trying to isolate is going to be problematic. So I just want you to think about here is access to new markets. There's growing markets. Africa, China's betting on Africa. Africa is a growing market. How big of a market they will be and how fast they're developing is a whole nother issue. They got a load of issues with high fertility rates, disease epidemics like Ebola and the AIDS epidemic, and a lot of instability still with their governments, lack of infrastructure. There's just so much that Africa has to do, but China's hedging on that. And we'll see where that is, but definitely we're seeing Southeast Asia grow as a market. That's why the TPP came in. The whole part of the TPP has been around in Southeast Asia for a while, and why the United States wanted to join it is because it would give the United States access to that market. And really what the United States was trying to do is we were trying to get access to that market because we didn't want China. It was more about the United States becoming a power player in that region. And then with us kind of pulling out of it a year and a half ago, and a lot of Americans not understanding what the TPP is and this idea that this is going to be an unfair trade agreement. Well, maybe it might have been a little unfair for the United States, but in a geopolitical world, what if that meant the United States could take power from China? But that's not the way many civilians think. That's a geopolitical way to think about it. And now since the United States pulled out, China's kind of stepped in and been a player in the TPP. And with the whole tariffs and embargoes and the trade war with China going on, even the United States a few weeks ago said, all right, we're ready to sit down and renegotiate the TPP because we realize that it's a multilateral world. Countries can't just go around bullying people anymore because there's too many players and countries will find somebody else, right? Anyways, there are growing markets. There's access to new markets that's kind of driving this deindustrialization, but also restructuring and trade networks. A couple other things with economics we got to think about. What about Africa with microcredit and macrocredit? I know that was a while ago, but I always come back to Africa in the sense of, how do we empower the people? And microcredit empowers, farmers, and specifically women, but microcredit just also empowers, the independent entrepreneur in Africa. And it has been successful in many ways, maybe not as successful and growing as some people may like, but it is empowering Africans to take their own responsibility rather than being dependent on the core as much. So we're starting to see, this idea that Africans have a little bit more rights. So we're starting to see not as much dependency. So macrocredit is investing in big entrepreneurs that create big business and instead of giving one entrepreneur a loan to become their own kind of business person, why don't we give it to somebody who has a big idea that can create jobs? So just two different ways and how we can empower Africans, but also microcredit and macrocredits being used in Latin America, Southeast Asia, the Middle East. It's really a model for the less developed countries. So we can see a combination of, loans from the IMF and the World Bank to help stabilize a lot of these LDCs economically. We can see, multinational corporations shifting production and outsourcing to these countries and creating jobs. So that helps those countries economically develop. So you have two prongs, investments from a UN kind of driven World Bank and IMF, corporations which aren't controlled by countries, and then you have things like microcredit, macrocredit. So you've got three different kind of ways that investing into these LDCs. So we start to see this development. So I've talked about the international trade blocks, whether it's ASEAN, which is in Asia, you have Mariscore, which is in Middle America or South America, you have NAFTA, you have the EU, you have the African Union, you have OPEC. There's all these different kind of trading blocks to kind of facilitate trade, TPP, Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership. So we start to see, this idea of these investments and these things are creating changes socially too. Gender equality, this idea that we're trying to get rid of gender inequality. We're trying to create, opportunities for children and future generations to break that, as Hans Rosling says, we're trying to break that sense of extreme poverty. If we can get people and provide opportunities. So it's really about breaking those down and going back to the UN sustainability goals and pay attention to those. I'm not going to go over all of them here, but go back and look at the UN millennial goals, that sustainable development, right? This idea of, the world is sustainable development is how do we operate in a world that's all about mass consumption. As a country develops, as the world becomes more developed, we're going to consume more. We're going to consume more resources. We're going to want more goods. As we gain more money, we're going to become more material. So that's part of the culture of the core. As they search for more money and more markets and growth and continuous growth, like Retzel says, countries need to continuously grow. That's facilitating the growth elsewhere. Well, that means somebody else is growing. So now we've got a bunch of growing countries all wanting resources and kind of sharing cultural values because of globalization. And as a result, it's consumption, mass consumption. And that's kind of that issue of overpopulation. How can we survive in a world like that? Resource depletion too. I mean, we're going to deplete non-renewable resources. How do we overcome that? How do we possibilism? Electric cars, or I just saw something about California. I don't know if it's true, but I saw California by, I think it was 2030 or something like that. All homes in California were going to have all solar panels. So they're going to be somewhat self-sufficient in energy production. What about wind production? What about all the the United States could harness the wind of the Great Plains and create massive amounts of energy for the entire country. But here's the issue. That would put coal miners out of business. That would put nuclear power plants out of business. So you have, political players, you have representatives, senators fighting for their people. And that's called sovereignty, because in a federal state, Kentuckians are going to fight for coal miners. West Virginians are going to fight for coal miners, and they have a say. And they're going to fight against wind, or they might fight against some of these green technologies. I'm not saying they're wrong or right, but they're doing what they feel is in the best interest of their people. Sovereignty. So we just got to think about, resource depletion. How do we manage those resources? Not just feeding ourselves, but, smart growth, building better cities, less fossil fuels. How humans will find a way. Okay, that's just what we got to think about. That's possibilism. Pollution. How do we manage climate change? That's part of it too. And as part of the sustainable development, the climate is changing. Whether it's natural or if it's human caused, that's up for debate, but we do know that things are changing, and it's causing, it can change agricultural patterns. What if, the climate does change and we get shorter growing seasons, or it creates desertification in one area while creating lush, greenery and land elsewhere? That's going to shift. So we don't know where that's at, but we do understand as humans, we have a responsibility for sustainable development. How can we sustain the future? Because 150 years ago, we never had this population, and we're at 7.5 billion, 8 billion people. And within the next 15 years, we're going to be 9.5 billion. And by 2050, we're going to be around 10.5 billion. Remember, it's a long time ago. I said, this is the number, 11. And 11 is the sustainable. Basically saying once we reach 11 billion, we can't sustain, the earth can't sustain it. We've reached max point. And we start to think about, every year there's a clock that says, when have we used up kind of our budget for the year? The Earth kind of says, all right, here's the Earth budget for that year. So we start to see that. All right, so kind of ending here, we start to think about equity and fairness and development. So this movement of industry. So if you have any questions, we can talk about it tomorrow. But I really wanted to emphasize political and industry tonight. And if you guys have any questions, just let me know. So this video should be up for you guys to watch over the next day or so. But I hope you guys have a good night.